What if I told you that, just 150 years ago, a sore throat could kill you? That doctors might drain a pint of your blood to balance your health? And that a mysterious, bad smell in the air was blamed for everything from cholera to the plague? In the 1800s, medicine was less about science and more about survival, superstition, and a bit of desperate hope. Every cough, every fever, was a gamble. And the treatments? Some worked, but many could make you sicker than the disease itself. Stay with me until the end, because every detail will make you grateful you weren't sick in the 19th century. Imagine waking up in a small wooden house on the edge of a dusty main street. It's the middle of the 19th century, and the morning air is cool, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. You don't feel well, your throat is raw, your body aches, but there's no pharmacy down the road. No antibiotics waiting in a neat little bottle. In fact, the word antibiotic hasn't even been invented yet. Back then, life was fragile in a way we can barely comprehend today. A simple cut on your hand from chopping firewood could lead to a deadly infection. Childbirth, something we now associate with hospital rooms and trained nurses, was one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. And the idea of washing your hands before treating a patient? That was considered strange, almost insulting to the doctor's skill. I sometimes think about how lucky we are. Today, I can walk into a clinic for something as small as a sinus infection and be home by dinner, feeling better in a few days. But in the 1800s, even the healthiest person lived under a quiet shadow, knowing that disease could arrive without warning and take everything. This was a world without vaccines for most illnesses, without X-rays to peer inside the body, without any real understanding of germs. Medicine was as much an art as it was a guess, built on traditions, beliefs, and whatever seemed to work, at least sometimes. And to truly understand how they treated disease, we have to start with what they believed caused it in the first place. Before doctors could cure an illness, they had to decide what they thought caused it, and in the 1800s, their ideas might surprise you. One of the most widely accepted beliefs was the miasma theory. People thought diseases drifted through the air in invisible clouds of bad smells. If you lived near rotting garbage, swampy water, or open sewers, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered dangerous to your health. And honestly, I can understand why they believed it. If a whole street started to smell terrible and people began getting sick, the connection seemed obvious. Then there was the much older humor theory, inherited from ancient Greece. According to this idea, the human body had four main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness came from an imbalance among them. If you had too much blood, the logical solution was to remove some, which is why bloodletting was so common. Of course, there were also deeply rooted cultural and religious explanations. Some saw disease as a punishment for moral failings or sins. Others believed it was the result of curses or bad luck, especially in rural communities where superstition still ran strong. When I think about it, I can't help but feel a mix of sympathy and amazement. They were doing their best with what they knew, piecing together patterns from the world around them. And while these theories weren't always correct, they shaped everything about how people treated the sick. Which brings us to the next part of our journey. What exactly did those treatments look like? Some were gentle and soothing, and others were downright dangerous. Once a doctor, or sometimes just a neighbor, decided what was wrong with you, the next step was treatment. And in the 1800s, that could mean almost anything. One of the most common practices was bloodletting. The belief was simple: if you had too much blood, draining it would restore balance. This could be done with a sharp blade or, more disturbingly, with leeches that would cling to your skin and drink until they dropped off. I can't imagine lying there, pale and weak, hoping that losing blood would somehow make me stronger. Another popular method was purging, essentially forcing the body to vomit or have diarrhea to flush out illness. Harsh laxatives and emetics were common, and while they sometimes relieved symptoms, they could also leave patients dangerously dehydrated. But not all remedies were so extreme. Herbal medicine played a huge role, especially in rural America where doctors were scarce. People used peppermint tea for stomach aches, willow bark for pain, which we now know contains a form of aspirin, and honey for sore throats. There were poultices made of onion, mustard, or bread and milk, pressed onto the chest to ease coughing. And then there were patent medicines, colorful bottles sold in shops and by traveling salesmen, often promising to cure everything from headaches to tuberculosis. They were marketed as miracle tonics, but many contained high amounts of alcohol, opium, or other dangerous ingredients. I think about these treatments, and it's a mix of admiration and alarm. On one hand, people were incredibly resourceful, making the most of what they had. On the other, some cures were as risky as the illnesses they were meant to fight. But when doctors weren't available or trusted, families often turned to something far closer to home. That's where folk medicine and home cures took center stage. For many families in the 1800s, calling a doctor wasn't the first step, it was the last resort. Doctors could be expensive, hard to reach, or simply unavailable, so people turned to what they knew best: remedies passed down from parents, grandparents, and neighbors. These cures often came straight from the kitchen or the garden. A spoonful of honey mixed with lemon for a stubborn cough, warm saltwater gargles for a sore throat, chamomile tea to calm the nerves or help with sleep. For a fever, some families would wrap the patient in vinegar-soaked cloths, believing it would draw out the heat. Then there were poultices and salves made from whatever was on hand, onions mashed into a warm paste for chest congestion, potato slices pressed to the forehead to pull out illness, or a mix of lard and herbs rubbed on the skin for joint pain. These methods might sound strange today, but many were born from observation and necessity. Superstition also played its part. In some communities, people carried charms or wore certain stones to ward off sickness. A red string tied around a child's wrist might be believed to protect them from the evil eye. As unusual as that sounds, it shows how medicine and belief were often intertwined, especially when there were no clear answers. I have to admit, there's something deeply human about these traditions. They were acts of care, ways to fight illness with the tools at hand, even if the science wasn't there yet. And while some of these home remedies may have offered real relief, others were simply rituals of comfort in a time when comfort was often the best you could hope for. But the 19th century wasn't entirely stuck in the past. This was also the era when the first real breakthroughs in modern medicine began to appear, slowly changing the way people understood and treated disease. By the middle of the 19th century, the world of medicine was beginning to shift. Slowly, almost quietly, discoveries were being made that would change everything, though at the time, many people didn't realize just how big these changes would be. One of the most life-saving breakthroughs was the smallpox vaccine. First introduced at the end of the previous century, it gradually became more common in the 1800s, offering real protection from a disease that had killed millions. It wasn't perfect, and it took decades for it to be widely accepted, but it was proof that prevention could work. Then came anesthesia, ether and chloroform, transforming surgery from a brutal, screaming ordeal into something bearable. Before this, operations had to be done in minutes, with patients held down by assistants. I can only imagine the relief people must have felt knowing they wouldn't have to stay awake through the knife. Perhaps the most profound change came from a man named Louis Pasteur, and the growing acceptance of germ theory, the idea that tiny, invisible organisms caused disease. It seems obvious to us now, but at the time it was revolutionary. Doctors like Joseph Lister began promoting sterilization, washing hands, and cleaning surgical tools. Even so, many resisted the idea, unwilling to abandon the ways they'd been taught. Looking back, it's clear these were the first real steps toward the medicine we know today. The smallpox vaccine hinted at a future of prevention. Anesthesia opened the door to safer, more precise surgery. Germ theory gave science the keys to truly understand illness. But for the people living through it, these changes were just the beginning. Most still lived in a world caught between old beliefs and new discoveries, where hope and fear often walked hand in hand. And that's what makes the final part of this story so powerful, looking back from our time and realizing just how far we've come. When I think about the way diseases were treated in the 1800s, I feel two things at the same time: deep gratitude and deep respect. Gratitude, because we now live in a world where a simple infection is rarely a death sentence, where vaccines protect us before we even get sick, and where surgery can be done without unbearable pain. Respect, because the people back then faced illness with courage, creativity, and a stubborn will to survive, even when the odds were against them. It's easy to look back and shake our heads at the strange cures and mistaken beliefs. But those were stepping stones. Every leech, every herbal tea, every risky experiment was part of the long, messy journey toward the medicine we know today. Without their trial and error, we wouldn't have our antibiotics, our sterile operating rooms, or our deep understanding of germs. I think that's the real lesson here. Progress doesn't happen overnight. It's built over generations, by people who dare to question, to try, and to hope. And it reminds me that the treatments we have today might look just as primitive to people 200 years from now. So next time you take a painkiller, get a vaccination, or walk into a clean, bright hospital, take a second to imagine the world before all this. It might make you appreciate it just a little more. If this journey into the past made you see our modern world in a new light, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your favorite surprising fact from this video in the comments. Give it a like if you enjoyed it. And subscribe so you won't miss our next story from history. You never know what lesson it might hold for the present.